Welcome to Syntax. In this episode, this Monday Hasty Treat, we have CJ Reynolds on, and he's going to share with us why you should be checking out and using Hono. Hono being the modern new JavaScript, I don't know, is it a backend framework or is it a server? I don't know. We're going to learn from CJ what the heck this thing is and why you should use it. My name is Scott Dolinsky. I'm a developer from Denver. And with me as always is Wes, but also CJ. What's up, CJ?
Hey. Not much. Super excited to talk about Hono. I've released a video on building an API with it and more videos coming soon on Hono. So yeah, Hono is great. I've been loving it.
Sick. Cool. Well, we're super stoked. If you are using Hono, you probably have an application. You want to make sure. Maybe it's your first time using Hono and you want to catch all those bugs you might introduce because maybe you didn't watch CJ's video and you thought you could do it yourself and you introduced some bugs into your code base. Well, you want to check out Sentry at sentry.io/syntax. Sign up and get 2 months for free. You got to use that coupon code at TastyTreat, but you use that coupon code, you get 2 months for free. Solve your bugs with Sentry. All right, CJ, let's kick it off. What is Hono? Why should we care? What do you love about it? Let's hear it.
So yeah, Hono is a web application framework. They call themselves fast, lightweight, built on web standards, and supports any JavaScript runtime. So essentially, if you're in the JavaScript ecosystem and you have or had been building apps with Express, Hono is kind of like the modern alternative to Express. And so essentially, it allows you to build backend APIs. They do also have a meta framework called Hono X. So technically, you could do more like server rendered things if you want to. And like it has first-class support for JSX, so if you need like a one-off route that returns HTML, it can do that too. But yeah, Hono is basically a way of building back-end apps with JavaScript and TypeScript.
I have a question. Hono X. Weston, you might know the answer to this as well. It's not a Cloudflare project, right? But it is now being...
So Cloudflare hired the guy who builds Hono. Cloudflare hired him, so they now pay him to work on Hono full-time, I'm assuming. And they also released like Hono X, which is I think that they did this because it has like almost all the React APIs. It's really cool, tight integration with the backend. I think that Cloudflare is putting this out as their Next.js, because the reason so many people use Vercel is because Next.js is awesome. So they're trying to make a full stack framework, not just backend, which is what I typically thought of Hono as.
Yeah. And as far as I know, I think like right now it kind of has the idea of I don't think they support React server components just yet. And so this is a weird reference, but from what I've seen, it's similar to Dino Fresh, which I had some experience with, in that like everything's server rendered, but then some things can be islands. So they kind of take that approach for it. But but like Wes said, it's kind of like their entry point into the meta framework sphere. And probably eventually, once it gets out of experimental, you'll see them probably pushing it more for people to build apps with it.
Hey, San Francisco, we're going to be in town for GitHub Universe on October 28th, and we're doing a Syntax Meetup. You don't have to be going to the GitHub Universe conference to meet up with us, but if you are in San Francisco, come hang out from 5 to 7 p.m. October 28th. We're going to be at the Bear Bottle Beer Garden in Salesforce Park. Admission is free. We're not going to charge you, but come hang out, and you need to grab a ticket via Eventbrite. So we put the link in our socials, in the newsletter. We'll put it in the show notes as well. Come check it out. Come hang out. Scott's going to be there. I'm going to be there. The whole team's going to be there. It's going to be exciting. See you then.
And so I just want to talk about why I like Hono and why I think you should try it. And so one of the first things I really like about Hono is how familiar it is. So if you've ever built an Express app, which most JavaScript developers have, it looks exactly like that. So you can see even on their homepage, you create an instance and then you do app.get, right? So this is like, these days, a very familiar way of defining backend endpoints. You have your app, You say, what is the method? What's the path? And then how is it going to respond? And Hono works in that exact same way.
Yeah, if you are like Express is obviously the big one out there. Express is absolutely massive still. And I want to like move off of Express, and I was like, what should I move to? And I think this is the very clear decision for this type of thing, because it's very Express feely, but it's all built on web standards. So you don't have to do any any like weird Express specific stuff, or like what was the Express is built on a common middleware called, what's the name of that?
Connect.
Is it Connect?
Connect. Yeah. So like the way Connect was a standard way to integrate plugins and middlewares and whatnot between all of these different frameworks, Express being the big one. Now web standards is that, in my opinion, right? So it's really nice because you can pull in a different plugins or whatever that just use request and response, web request, web response, and that's what Hono is built on.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the great things about like learning web standards as well, is because once you know how request and response work, you can be very effective inside of Hono. And that's like the second major reason I suggest Hono as something you should try is because of all the supported platforms. So if you look in their docs, they support Cloudflare, Dino, Bun, Fastly, Vercel, Netlify, AWS Lambda, Azure. Literally anywhere you want to run your code, they have an adapter for it. So like if we look in the Node.js example, you would build out your Hono app, but they expose this thing called Hono Node Server. And then you just pass your app into it and it serves it. But any other platform, they're going to expose a very similar adapter and you can just pass it in. One of the interesting ones is service workers. So you could build an app that like looks like a backend app, but essentially just runs inside of the web browser to like intercept responses for like caching and stuff like that. So you can it's a way of potentially building a service worker with a very familiar syntax, because you can just kind of like build out your endpoints like this. Yeah.
Really? So
Yes.
if I could build a Hono app that lives in a service worker and intercepts all JPEGs, and if that's the case, I could do something with that, throw a new version of it or cache it. Wow, I didn't even think of that, because that's a kind of a pain with service workers. Is that we should explain the way a service worker works is that you have like an HTML file, and that HTML file will request like dog.jpg or style.css and that will go to the server and bring back the thing. But a service worker will allow you to jump in between that request and possibly capture some of the data, and then it'll say, oh, I've actually cached that, or I want to modify that and somehow locally, you can go offline with it. There's all kinds of really nice features for it. That's neat.
Yeah. I would say the most experience I've had with service workers is seeing it used as the caching layer for like Create React app. It used to be when you generated a Create React app, it had that like little service worker file. And the code in there was, it would basically cache all of your JavaScript files so that the page would load faster after that. But it's an interesting way to think about it, because at that point, you're kind of like, you're writing code that looks like backend code, but it's technically running inside the browser. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
And Cloudflare Workers, the API for Cloudflare Workers is like almost the same as service worker, right? So that's probably, it wasn't much of a stretch to go from their Cloudflare Worker implementation to service worker.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar, but I mean, so I've done a few test deployments to Cloudflare. I guess they hide it all from you, because I didn't even see anything like service worker related. It's like you literally just write your Hono app and but yeah, I could see that.
If you're not using like a Hono on Cloudflare, you basically just get a like you listen for like a fetch event or something like that, and then it just dumps a payload of what it is, and then it's up to you to figure out routing and all of that stuff, which is, it's kind of bumbly. This is why you should use Hono if you're using Cloudflare.
Yeah. And then beyond that, they've kind of thought of everything. So if you look in their docs and then look under helpers, they have helpers for all the stuffs you would want to do inside of an API. So they have like, one of them is like just JWT helpers. So if you're rolling some auth and you need to encode JSON web tokens, you don't need to install a separate library. You can just use Hono JWT. They also have a built-in helper for like setting up a WebSocket endpoint, and then all kinds of like built-in middlewares as well. So like if you need basic auth, there's a middleware for that. If you need to add some caching headers, there's a middleware for that. If you need cores, there's a middleware for that. So all of this stuff is kind of just built in and very well supported by the library itself. So like in my testing of Hono, every single one of these that I came across, haven't had any issues with. And even just like looking at the GitHub issues and discussions, they respond to them very quickly. So I think one of the caveats of having to support all of this stuff internally is the fact that you have to respond to like help requests, and it's like a bigger API surface layer. But
Yeah.
that's one of the things that was trickier about Express is like going and finding all these middlewares to do the things that you wanted because it wasn't built in. All this stuff is built into Hono.
Man, deny list. I don't see a rate limiter just yet. That's something that I have to often throw in.
They have one, what is it called? Docs, middleware, scroll all the way down, third-party middleware. Yeah, Hono rate limiter. Nice. I will say that's because there's so much. That's probably one of the issue, like the biggest issues I've had is just trying to like find it in the docs because there's so many things available. But yeah, there it is. If you need rate limiting in your app, install that middleware, set up your time window and like your key generator. Good to go. While we're here, it's also important to mention that they have a Sentry middleware. So if you want to add Sentry to your own Hono app, literally just npmi @Hono/Sentry, pass in your DS in, app.use, done. It's tracking all your Sentry errors. And then one more thing is JSX support. So I mentioned earlier that you can use JSX, but like if you think of like the days of building something with Express, typically you'd have to set up like a view engine and then choose your view engine. Like, do you want handlebars? Do you want EJS? Do you want whatever else? Hono supports JSX out of the box. So whenever you generate an app, it already has all the compiler options and everything that you need. And so you can just do c.html and then pass in some JSX.
I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. When I was working on a little HTMX meta framework I was calling Hype, which I've stopped working on, but I used gratuitously that HTML. It was super nice to use in addition with things like HTMX or in general.
Exactly.
Yeah, I used to use just like straight up functions that return strings, like template strings, right?
Yeah.
But the downside to that is you have to worry about XSS, right? And then also you're essentially just creating an entire templating framework.
Right.
Exactly. It's much easier to simply just use JSX JSX is a very good templating framework, and it's not the greatest. Like I still am waiting. We've been talking about JSX 2.0 for many, many years, the ability to type specific children and things like that. But it's kind of what we standardize on in most cases.
Yeah. It's funny, Wes. I've written so many plugins for Remark and whatever. I've basically written my own Markdown-based templating language now. And I often think like, that's a bad idea to do that. Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll never learn.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the beautiful things, though, because like JSX allows you to define components, and that's typically what we're trying to do. So like you could even see this composition example here, right? They have basically the body that just passes in a child, and then they have some other component that can render inside of it. And so like if you wanted to build this out with your own functions and like template strings, it'd be some work. I will mention, like if you look into their docs, they have an even better way of doing this, because you can basically define your renderer that kind of like renders the shell. And then you can have other routes that will get rendered into that shell. So you can set it up that way too. And then if you ever need like raw HTML or you need to insert like a script, they have like little helpers where you can insert that stuff into your JSX.
I have a question that maybe you can answer. This is something I always hit whenever I spin up a Hono app is your route handlers, if you type it as like app.get /cards / like a card number, and that's like a param, in there. And all of that stuff is all nicely typed as soon as you get into the route handler because you have attached it to the route definition. But I find myself being like, I kind of want to put this in a separate file and just have a list of all of my routes in one file and then link off to it. And then I find that's really hard. I find like you miss a lot of the complicated typings. Is there anything for that?
There is. So first I'll start with, if you look in their docs and you look under best practices, they say, don't do this.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, just put it in the thing.
But I think like this is one of the things that a lot of people really appreciated about the video that I made is I showed how you can do this and keep type safety. So if we look in so for the recent video I made on syntax, I created a starter template. It's called the Hono OpenAPI starter. And if you look in source, go into routes, and then I have a tasks folder. I've shown how we can kind of like break it out. I just have this custom type here called app route handler, and then I pass in the type of the route. This essentially just wraps the route handler type. I show how to do it in the video, but once you got it going, it's pretty simple because then your routes, you just say, what's the type of the route? use this. This also passes in your bindings and anything you would need for like every single request. But then from there, all of this is fully validated. So like this line right here where I say c.rec.valid param, this is getting the ID from the URL, but as a validated number. So it used a Zod validator to get there. And you get that type inside of this code here. And this code will never make it here unless that validator was valid.
And so it's kind of circular where your route definitions import your handler and your handler imports your route definition type. Is that true?
Well, it's purely types. It's just pulling in those, like the create type, the get one, the list type, but it's just the type, because otherwise, it would be like a circular dependency. You could basically like define your validators in a similar way if you wanted to like export the type.
And if you have middleware that monkeys with the types, does that still flow through to the final handler?
That all comes down to defining your base type. So I feel like we're getting in the weeds now, but go watch my video because it'll teach you about all this stuff.
But, I'm here for it.
So I set this up here. So I have basically every single one of my routers. I just reuse this function and it passes in those types. So we can look directly in the Hono docs. If you look for the app and then look under generics, you can pass in a type that defines variables and then also like your environment variables that you would use in Cloudflare workers. But this is synonymous with, if you remember in Express, it was like app.get and app.set, I think.
Yeah.
Like you could set the user in a middleware and then access that user in some other middleware. And so basically what you do is you create this type here that says, this is what you're going to have access to. These are your variables. And then every other handler and middleware can do c.get user and get access to it. So yeah, in this case, the only variable that I have is my logger because I'm using a thing called Pinot logger, but that makes it accessible at all. So in my handlers. So literally any one of my handlers, I can do c.var.logger and then get access to debug, info, inspect, that kind of thing.
Oh, nice little utility middleware. I like that.
Yeah.
I've always liked Pinot. I believe that's from the Fastify folks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it is. I've always used it for logging. It's basically structured logging. So in your logs always show up as like JSON, and then you can actually have some sort of like log aggregator that pulls these in and like does like visualizations and reporting. But yeah, I've used it with Express before, and there's a middleware for Hono Pinot that lets you pull this in, and now you can have logging for all of your requests.
Sick. I love that.
One thing I'll show you is validation. So we got into the weeds. We're showing some of that open API code, but if you just want some basic validation for the params in your URL or the body, they have the ability to pass in a validator as a middleware. And so you can define your route, pass in your validators, and then access those things in a type safe way inside of your handler.
That's nice. I love that. You take all the like fussing around, like, is it there? Is it the correct type? You know, like having to put that in every single route handler is really annoying. It's nice that when you can write your handler, assuming everything is perfect and in place.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that like, it was so easy to get wrong in Express. Like I saw so many beginners, like they weren't validating params. They sometimes not even validating the body, but Hono makes it super simple. And especially if you combine it with Zod, because then you can define all of your Zod validate. Like these days, Zod is like almost a mainstay in the TypeScript ecosystem. But yeah, the Zod validator makes it a whole lot easier, right? Form, this is my stuff, done. And yeah, we're running lower on time, so I
think we can go as long as we want. It's
we
like
own the show.
It's our show. We do whatever we want.
Sweet. I guess. So after this, I guess I'll show you RPC. So this is one of the other super cool things is like build out your routes like you're used to, like you might have used to have done with Express. But the issue with that is if you wanted to call it from a client-side front end or something like that, then you have to, I don't know, copy paste the types in or write the types yourself if you want some sort of type safety. Hono has this idea of RPC built in. I'm showing my screens right here, and we have a route definition defined. So it defines the URL, it defines the validator, and it defines the handler. So it's all the things you need for a backend request. But if we say type of on that variable, that type can be passed into the Hono client, and then you get a fully typed client. So literally all we do is say type of, and then now in my client-side code, I say client dot. It'll show me all of the available endpoints or all of the available URLs and methods.
Yeah.
And then I can get access to all of those, and all of the data you pass in is type checked as well.
That's amazing. So like Hono client essentially is a JavaScript, like client-side JavaScript library that if you pass it your types and hook it up to your URL, you immediately have this thing where you can say like it's not an ORM, but it kind of feels like that, right? You could say like episodes.find, and if you have a endpoint hooked up for that, you could do it. Or if you want to be able to like delete a specific item, it's fully typed. It knows what arguments you need to pass it. There's no need to create API endpoints for all of these things that you want to do, which I find exhausting. Like, oh, I have to make an API endpoint to create, read, update, delete every single piece of data. It just goes, and you have full access to it.
Exactly. And I think one of the beautiful things is the types just flow through. Like, there's no code generation here. That's another aspect of like working with backend APIs and front end. Like, a lot of times you might have to run a build step that like generates the types or generates the client. This, you don't have to do that. If you're in a mono repo, you can literally just import that type.
Yeah, type inference in that way is so nice when it isn't generated. I do think, generated works, but it's always kind of a pain in the ass sometimes. Even with SvelteKit, they generate some types when you run svelte.dev. And like, if you haven't ran svelte.dev in a second, you're getting some type errors if you've created
the
a new
older
route
ones
or something. It hasn't, so you stop and start the process or whatever, restart your TypeScript server, and it's like, I just don't want to do any of that, you know?
I was just going to say, SvelteKit probably does one of the best
for
this type of stuff. It's very, because you simply just, if you return data from a, what is it called? I was going to say loader. It's not a loader in SvelteKit. What is it? It's a loader in Remix.
It's a load function. Or an action.
Load function. Yeah, it is a loader. Okay, we'll call it that. But then it just immediately, the types go right from your back end to your front end, and you get the autocomplete go burr.
Yes, exactly. Autocomplete go burr.
And this is something, a lot of times you'll see people combine this inside of a Next.js app. So they talk about adding Hono inside of a Next.js application, and essentially you add a catch-all route handler. So like inside of your Next.js app, /API /bracket route bracket. So that means any request coming into API is going to hit this handler. And then you just export a Hono app from that handler. And so from there, all of your Next.js pages and components can now just use that same typed Hono client, but it's living inside of your Next.js application.
Oh, maybe this is what I want. Because like I want like the Next.js experience. I want the app router, but I want the like middleware dev experience of Hono. But I also don't want to run like I have a big enough mono repo right now. You know, wouldn't it be nice to just stick it in there? That's cool. I didn't know you could do that.
I haven't played around with this yet, but I can imagine it's really nice to work with, because like any client component, you pull in the Hono client, maybe you combine it with something like Tanstack query or something like that.
Yeah.
But then inside of server components, you could actually make requests directly to the Hono app. Yeah, let's just look at the guide on testing. So testing is something that you should do. One of the things about like testing express APIs is you had to pull in like a separate library like super test, and then it would like be able to send requests to it. We don't even have to talk about tests right now. I'm only showing this file because the Hono app exposes a request method that just behaves like a requester. So basically, when you say app.request, that's not making a network request. That's just basically invoking that function directly. So you pass in URL, you pass in params or whatever else. So I could imagine that you combine this with the Hono client. So inside of your Next.js app, maybe it's a server component. Maybe you don't want to make an API call there. Maybe you want to call that endpoint directly. You could just import the Hono app.request, pass in the URL in your data, and then there's no hop, right? It's not calling the network and then putting it into the server component. It's calling that JS code directly. So yeah, this request method that's exposed is pretty nice.
That's nice. Wow. I didn't even know that you went deep on this. That's anyone who hasn't checked out CJ's YouTube videos, he goes deep, man. It's not just a hello world and don't talk about any of the problems that you're gonna hit. You know, like we should be thinking about this. What does the testing situation look like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even beyond that, they have a testing helper too. So like this requester literally this takes a web standard request. Like you can literally pass in a capital R request object right there. But of course, that's not typed because it's just a request object. But if you look at their test helper, you pass your app into it, and then it behaves just like the Hono client that I showed earlier. It has all the endpoints, it has all the methods, and then now that's just requesting it directly, right? It's not heading over the network.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So that's pretty much all I had. I like it. I've been spending a lot of time with it. I've built like several apps with it. It's great. I think it's also like it's a little bit newer, but the ecosystem is awesome. The community is awesome too. Like if just looking at their GitHub repo, the discussions are fairly active, and also looking at like a number of open issues, those are pretty active as well in terms of like people responding to them. So yeah, I'm definitely betting on Hono. I think it's here to stay, and I'm going to be using it for a lot of my stuff.
Yeah, and I'm sure the Cloudflare backing doesn't hurt there either. That's a big benefactor.
Definitely.
Yeah, no kidding. The integration with Cloudflare, if you are using it and you want to be able to use like their database product offering, it's just it's very, very smooth. Like if you buy in on all of this, it's not even buying in because it works anywhere. But
yeah.
I love Cloudflare so much, but sometimes it's really hard to get up and running. And this takes that barrier away and makes it so simple. I'm excited to see the Hono X stuff, see how that sort of shakes out, because the only reason I don't use Hono, or the only reason I would move off of it, is because, you know what? I really do want like a full stack framework. I want the whole back end thing, but I also want to be able to pull Svelte or React or whatever in on the front end as well. And also the Hono X doesn't have a, maybe they do. The RPC. For some reason, I thought there was no RPC with Hono S, but I guess you just use Hono Client, right?
I believe so.
On Hono X.
And that's one more thing I didn't even mention is like technically Hono also has their own like client side React library. Like it's technically Hono JSX instead of React. I think you can still use React with it, but if you're using Hono X, then technically you're using like their version of it.
Yeah, they've like re-implemented most of the React API. So most of your use effect, use state, things like that will transition over one-to-one.
Yeah. I guess one last thing I'll mention, because I think this is like the hardest part, is if you in a bigger Hono application of getting good type support, is like basically it was covered in the best practices section of their docs, where like if you define these things separately, then like your types aren't flowing through. But you also have to imagine, what if I have like 20 routes? How am I going to get a Hono client that has all of those types integrated? And I show how to do that in the Hono starter that I created, where essentially you put all of your Hono routers inside of an array, and then just create a type that's a type of everything in that array. And this essentially gives you that fully typed client that you can pass to Hono client, and it has everything. It's every single route that you registered everywhere else, but you can do it in a more scalable way, right? They all live in their own folder. They all have their own files and handlers, but this one type right here is kind of how they're all like brought back together.
Oh, I like that. And then you can use like dot notation to access the types instead of having to import every single one.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that was like I'm a big fan of Hono, but I learned quite a bit there. I'm really excited about it. I think if you haven't yet tried it, certainly watch CJ's video and give it a shot yourself.
Sick. And we'll link to that in the show notes, because again, it is like Wes said, it's deep. Because I watched about half of it yesterday, CJ. I'm going to finish it just because the Open API stuff, I almost said OpenAI. Open API stuff, Swagger doc stuff is a complete mystery as to what the heck that even is. I've heard of it. I'd never used it. Don't know much about it. So I'm going to have to check out that stuff in too. Yeah.
Awesome.
Sick. Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us today, CJ. And we will catch you in the next one.
Peace.
Peace.